When I was given the knowledge, it was obvious to me that there were certain things that I was going to be able to introduce and get across to people, and that there were certain things that were going to have to wait because they were much more specific, and that they would require a great deal of background and education. Many of you who have been part of my teaching process for almost as long as I've been teaching human design know that my concentration has been on being able to read a basic chart and being able to get to a point where you can offer people an answer to their question, which is, how can I be helped? And that answer is, you have a design, you have a type, you have a strategy, you have an authority. That is the way in which you can heal yourself. That is a way in which you can find yourself. That's a way in which you can decondition yourself. In setting up this particular course with Ilse, what I had in mind for doing here, in the context of the psychology as an overall heading, is that this is the heart of it. And the heart of it is what's called color. And it is the heart of it because it is one of the most important themes to be able to understand about the helplessness of a human being. And that helplessness goes beyond the limitation of the personality. That helplessness goes beyond the lack of communication with one's design. That helplessness is something that is very, very profound. There has been, for as long as we have been investigating the way in which we think, the way in which we operate on the mental plane, there has always been this inference to motivation, and that somehow motivation is something that we ourselves are responsible for. And that the secret is then to find out where that motivating force originated in one's psychological life, whether that's trauma or whatever the case may be. What I want to bring you to today is to show you that each and every one of us has underlying themes, and these underlying themes motivate us. They color, and I'm using this in the context of the way in which that could be used in English. In other words, coloring as an adjective. We can color things. We can color them blue, we can color them red, we can color them angry, we can color them sweet. In other words, there is an underlying coloring that belongs to every activation that exists in a chart. Because when we're dealing with color, we're dealing with the substructure of a line. Now, most of you have only in your experience been able to get to that place where the line seems to be it. But please understand that there are many levels. You've been given a sheet so you can see some of the names and the keynotes and whatever. There are many levels that exist in the substructure of the line. That first level beneath the surface, that level is called color. And what color brings us is it brings the specific motivation about how any line is actually going to operate in the world. Now, I want you to think about your experience. One of the things you discover as an analyst, once you've done enough readings, once you've looked at enough charts, is that you'll see somebody, for example, that has a certain gait and a certain line. You know somebody else who has a certain gait and a certain line. They happen to be exactly the same, but both of those lines function differently. They don't seem to operate in the same way. And they don't seem to operate in the same way because the underlying motivation is different. Now, this is not something that's there for popular analysis. It's not there for the professional job of introducing somebody to their type. But it's very, very important in the study of the human condition, in the study of what it is to operate within the constraints of this vehicle, that it's an essential piece of information. Number one, to reinforce the fact that we are helpless. And number two, to get rid of the vanity of the assumption that we're responsible for behaving the way we do, acting the way we do, all of those things. In other words, for us to see that this is a mechanical reality, that motivation, underlying motivation, is a mechanical reality. And we're going to look and see how each of these aspects operate and how they influence the line above. There are 6 colors. There are 6 colors that are possible underneath each line, which means that each and every line that exists in the body graph, that each of those lines can actually operate out of 6 different motivations. And of course, that makes them, in a sense, quite different when they finally get to the surface, as you'll see. The third line theme is the theme of bonds made and broken. And it is a very personal theme of dealing with the trial and error process, the suffering that comes with the potential for failure. And one of the things to recognize is that the leadership that comes out of that is a leadership that's based on its own trial and error process. And then that leadership based on its own trial and error process, that's laid out as a way for followers. But it is very personal. It is not transpersonal in that sense. It comes out of the personal process. This didn't work for me, ergo, it will not work for you. Okay, so this is the way in which that movement works. When we step over that invisible line and we go to the 4th color and its relationship in resonance to the 4th line, we move into the transpersonal. And in moving into the transpersonal, development requires relationship. In other words, there is no development without a direct relationship to the other. Now, that direct relationship to the other in the 4th color, the color of need, this is a polarity of the master and the novice. And this relationship of master and novice, and to take that out of the spiritual context, just somebody who knows something and somebody who doesn't, that they cannot get that impersonally. They're not going to be able to get that by being at the back of the auditorium in a university lecture space. They need to have the direct contact in order for them to develop. And it's a very important thing. 3rd color people don't need direct contact to develop. They're not dependent on the other in that way. What they need is guidelines that they can work with themselves. And if those guidelines happen to be correct for them, then everything is fine. But the moment that you're dealing with the 4th color and the way in which the 4th color influences the 4th line, its potential for opportunity, its potential to influence others, its potential to externalize, that development is based on a personal relationship, a personal developmental process through the agency of another. And so these 2 colors represent 2 very basic ways in which we're guided to develop, both from within ourselves and by the larger society that is around us. The impersonal development that's rooted in the 3rd color, and this very personal development that's rooted in the 4th color. There's something that you can intuit here and see very clearly about the distinction between the 3rd and 4th color. Remember the 3rd and 4th color, like the 3rd and 4th line? These are not stable points because they're places of transition. But look at the difference. When we're dealing with the 4th color is a harmony to the 1st. We have yet to see the harmony of the 3rd color to the 6th. And I want to take away one of those illusions that people have or simply not getting it right. When you look at master novice, the first thing you think about is spiritual masters. It's one of the first things that comes into mind. The master, because the language is there. The master and the novice. Now look, that 4th color has nothing to do with the 2nd color. That's dissonance. It has nothing to do with the spirituality. It is the externalization of the fear. It is the influencing of others through that. And it is the opportunist who takes the advantage and the opportunity to be able to do that, to be able to externalize that. The master is either a master of communalism or a master of separatism. whatever it may be, but I want you to understand that it is really mundane. What it's talking about is something very simple. Some people can only learn directly. I mean, I know that. I know that in my own experience. There's some people that can only learn human design, from me, direct. There are other people that will learn human design in any way that's impersonal. They'll read the book and they'll take this and take that. In other words, there are different ways in which we develop. But it's very important to see that if you're carrying a fourth line in your profile, for you to understand that valued learning in your life must come directly from a teacher. In other words, you have to have that direct contact. And it's only out of that direct contact that you're really going to be able to develop. At the same time that if you're a third line being in your profile, to recognize that that's not the answer for you. That the answer for you is simply being able to get access to the right kind of information for guidance, rather than being dependent on development through a personal relationship. In other words, having to be shown. It's like people that, buy something and there's a manual. There are some people that can just go through that manual and they figure it all out by themselves and everything's terrific. They've been given their third line guidance. And then there's that third color. And then there's that fourth color person that you give them that manual and they get on the phone and call a friend. Excuse me, come over here and help me. Because otherwise I'm not going to get this. So it's as developmental themes. How important to see that. And also, again, where my concern always is for kids. To really look at your children, for example, and look at, young kids going into school and stuff like that. Look at the mental themes they have in terms of line themes and see very clearly where, they're going to need direct help or where they don't need direct help. In other words, to begin to understand, or through their profile, to begin to understand what will help them develop better, more easily. And of course, that fourth color, the third color, they're going to show you through their resonance, in that sense, to the lines, they're going to show you what kind of developmental process is best for that being. So very important theme, to look at and to recognize that, the very basic difference between them. And don't think Master Novice is spiritual, because it isn't. It isn't. It's simply about learning how to, getting knowledge directly from the other. You got to be in their aura. You got to be able to smell them. You got to be able to touch them. You have to have that connection to them.
Now all the fourth profiles come to touch you. Be careful.
Well, no, I mean, I having all those first lines, I have a harmony to that process. In other words, I understand that need, which is why to some level, I can allow people to get into my aura because it's written in that sense. And of course, what I'm giving them is all this first line structure stuff, so all of that is fine. But what's important for me in the distinction between the two is how valuable that is in helping people and guiding people towards what developmentally will work for them. In other words, if you have a strong third color resonating in your design, you don't have to go to the guru to have that trial and error experience. You can read the guru's book. You don't physically have to be there. You don't have to have the contact. You don't have to have the contact to get the buzz. In other words, you can read the book and get just the same experience as the fourth color person who has to be there in the aura. And this is something so important to grasp. It's just different ways that we develop. And once we understand that about ourselves, then we can stop punishing ourselves. Forcing ourselves to do a fourth color job when it's really a third color. In other words, allowing ourselves to develop correctly. And again, when I say things like that, not about choices. If you are living out your design, if you're honoring your strategy, your authority, you're going to operate correctly and according to the way in which you resonate to things and so forth and so on. And if you're a fourth line in your profile, it's going to be very hard for you not to have somebody directly teach you in that sense. In other words, these things are going to come if you're living out, your process correctly. Sometime in the early 90s when I was first teaching, Jürgen and I were working with some people in Berlin, and one of them was married to a twin. And those twins, their challenge was, well, show us what's different. I mean, they had the same design. And that was the first time that I just pulled out the color just to see the difference in the motivations. And then when the two of them came in, I described that basic difference. And of course, that was overwhelming for them. That was somebody actually can see the difference in the two of us, and we've always been able to see the difference. So it's very important to understand that this underlying theme of motivation, what it does is it brings nuances. Let's look at structure for a moment. We start with a gate, and then we know that a gate has 6 variations, so that we have 6 line variations. When we get to the line, there are 6 colors underneath that line, so you have those 6 variations underneath the line. There are 6 variations of color, and those 6 variations of color are the 6 tones, and tones have to do with the way in which we are, in terms of our senses, the way in which we orient, and the way in which our awareness is determined. And then you get down to 5 bases that lie, 5, not 6, 5 bases that lie underneath each tone. It is not possible for us, as sentient beings, it is not possible for us to be attuned to bases and tones. We have no way of getting there. In fact, if we could get there, we would all be blissed out, because that's the place where the Department of Planning gives us all our jobs and we're all working together and everything's wonderful. However, what we can get to, in a way, is that we can always get to color. Now, the way in which this works, and it's something very important to grasp, when I began teaching profile and I began teaching the way in which the nature of lines work. Is that where I was?
Nature of lines work.
Why don't I have a gun in this job?
That's why.
When I was dealing with profile and line structure, one of the first things I taught was harmony and resonance. Very important to understand that in the nature of the structure of the hexagram, to be able to see, for example, that the first line and the fourth line, they have a harmonic relationship to each other. And that the second line and the fifth line, that the third line and the sixth line. In other words, that's harmony. That if you have a first line and you meet somebody who has a first line, that's a resonance. In other words, that there are basic relationships that exist within the line structure. Now, something very important to understand is that the tones have a harmony-resonance relationship with color. The line above has a harmony relationship with color, but tones don't have a relationship to the line. In other words, the medium between what we live as a conscious being and what we're actually a part of as one large conscious entity, that the arbiter, if you will, that the middleman, if you will, this is color. And the color is going to resonate or harmonize with lines. In other words, if you're somebody who happens to have a first color, that first color is going to color everything. And it's particularly going to color those things that it harmonizes with. It's particularly going to color those things that it resonates to. So the structure is important for you to see that motivation is more than just that. At the psychological level, we'll see its value in terms of seeing how it does, in fact, motivate us. But I also want you to understand color at another level. I want you to see that by coming to grips with the motivating forces in our life, we're actually getting closer to our place within the whole and moving further away in that sense from the vanity of being separate and the illusion that comes with that separateness. Again, I want to remind you that we're working from the bottom up so that it is color that, conditions the way in which the line is going to operate. And as such, it creates a limitation. The reality is that the third color is going to be limited in terms of their development by those things that they develop themselves. And what's going to happen to them is, of course, because of conditioning at other levels, that they can be tempted to go into the fourth color process. And that fourth color process isn't going to bring them development. In other words, development is going to be limited to them finding, quote unquote, their truth. And finding their truth, and whether it means being the follower at the impersonal level in order to get to a point, whether through trial and error, that is truth or not, it ultimately is their own process. Development for them is their own personal development, and they're the ones that have to come to their own truth. And by the way, when they come to their own truth, they're the embodiment of that leadership. In other words, that's the moment that they've really developed. They've developed to a point where they have their own structure that they have developed into on their own. But when you're dealing with somebody who's resonating to the fourth color, they're not going to be able to develop without the other. They can't. Look at the way the fourth line works, the opportunist. Don't leave a lover till you have another lover. You can't do it without the other. And so you better wait until there's another to take the place of the other so you can have that direct development. Don't leave your job till you have another job. It's the same thing. And all of that is being motivated by this underlying theme of the fourth color that says the only development that you're going to get in this life is through learning, through growing, through that process of connecting with the other directly. It's one of the keys in management. Is to be able to see the way in which employees need to be guided. Because the third color employee can get a memo in the mail. But the fourth color employee needs that direct, excuse me, because there has to be that direct contact. So we are being conditioned in that sense underneath that line level to develop in those ways. So why waste your time? Again, the value of mechanical knowledge is that the moment that you can see what you, in that sense, resonate at the profile level, aside from, as I'm saying, you have one angle here to get access to the feel of color, and that's through what you already have as a profile and seeing the resonance. When you get to a point, if you can, to be able to see your colors, and your colors not just in your profile, but every single one of your gates, you'll begin to see how incredible this underlying motivational package operates. But very, very important at the surface to recognize that if you're going to be either a third line or a fourth line being in terms of your profile, to recognize the conditioning influences on you and to be very clear how important that is for you. That you need to go in that direction. In that sense, it's going to pull you in that direction. The forces are going to pull you in that direction. They're either going to pull you into the personal or they're going to pull you into the impersonal. And you can see how that's affected you in your life. In other words, you can see why, your developmental direction has gone in a certain way. And certainly in the future, this motivational knowledge, remember, this knowledge is basically useless. It is. Until we have enough human beings who have accurate time, to be able to generally apply this knowledge correctly, because just by looking at the resonance you have in your profile, all that's telling you is what the conditioning forces do to you. It doesn't really tell you what is truly natural in that sense for you. So until you get to the point, until we have population that gets to the point where they know their own colors, where we can as professionals analyze that completely, only then are we going to see how complex the underlying motivational field is. And that it's so important for us to let go. Again, I take you to this level of knowledge simply to remind you that you're helpless. There's all these motivational forces underneath you have no control over, and the only way that you're going to operate correctly through all of this is you operate as yourself. You operate according to your design, and then you'll see that those things will work correctly for you. Very easy for me with all my first lines to resonate to my personal contact with voice. In other words, it's very clear to see why that was going to be my development. Aside from anything else, great conditioning factor on me. In other words, these are things that you can begin to look at, and you can look at your own process, and you can see how these motivational themes in the larger world have conditioned you and influenced you. And of course, the difficulty in all of that is that many people are influenced into, let's say, a fourth color process when in fact it isn't for them. Or a third color process, and in fact it isn't for them. But it's hard for us to tell until we can see precisely what their design is. When you look at color as a generalized theme, there are a couple of things that it reveals that are very profound. There is this assumption that only certain types, for example, generators, which is a classic example, that only certain types are here to actually wait, or the projector has to wait for the invitation, or the reflector has to wait for the movement of the moon, and supposedly manifestors don't wait. It's not true. One of the things that you get to see about color is that the sub-theme under color, it's called response. One of the most important things to understand about being human is that we are reactive, not creative. We are reactive. That's what we are. We are always responding to the life force. And one of the things to understand about color is that all color, in other words, all motivation, is response. All of it is response. Now, the way that it looks on the surface varies from type to type, design nuance to design nuance. But the first thing to understand that color shows us is we have, no choice. And we have no control. We don't have any of that. We don't have any of that because the way in which we're going to respond to stimulus, the way in which we're going to respond to our movement in space, that response is already written and it's underneath the line. It's not like you even have real access to it. It's just there. And right away, this whole concept of choices goes out the window. The second thing is that color is not only subtitled as response, but beneath that, it's called the modes. In police work, they talk about modus operandi. In other words, the way in which you are going to operate. Now think about that. When you're dealing with this theme of motivation, this theme of color, what you're dealing with is you have no choice but to respond in a certain way in which you're going to operate in the world, and that certain way is written and it will be lived out through the line, ultimately the gate and the design as a whole. In other words, when you get to this place of color, you get to this place of helplessness. Helplessness. The way in which we're going to deal with anything. The thematic, if you will, parameters of how we will respond and operate in relationship to anything. That's what you find in the color. And then that color is going to, again, color the way the line will operate, the way it will ultimately operate through the design. I always wait and see over the years when people recognize that something's funny. Now, I don't mean funny in terms of humor, I mean funny, strange. And nobody's ever mentioned it to me. Look at profile, and you'll notice something very, 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 very unusual about the fourth line. And the one thing to notice about the fourth line is that the fourth line is the only line that is never part of the left angle. It's the only one. You have the 1-4, the 2-4, the 4-6, and the 4-1. But you have no left angle 4. And the reason that I bring this up is to understand that when you're looking at the structure of color and you're looking at it in terms of its three binaries, and we looked at the first binary this morning and looking at the structure of the 1-2 and seeing this as a basic framework, the church and state, the basic structure. We've looked at 3-4 and see that 3-4 is about development. It's all about development. And by the way, that development is always personal, even though it looks like, for example, the fourth color, that it's transpersonal because you have to get it from the other, but it's still the way you get it. In other words, you have to get it directly rather than you have to get it indirectly. So the moment that we move to the final binary, when we move to the fifth and sixth colors, you can really see that the left angle quality is really very, very different than those other four colors beforehand. And very different because what they represent is they represent completion, in that sense, of the developmental process. And completion of the developmental process in the sense of articulating that outwards, transpersonally, getting the word out or getting the news out. And again, two ways of doing that. Two ways of getting the word out. The fifth colorway and the sixth colorway. And they're very different ways of getting all of that out to the totality. So when we're looking here at the structure of color, to see very clearly that unlike looking at lines in which you see the basic two trigrams, what you're looking at in color is very specific binaries, a triplicity of binaries, and by understanding that binary structure underneath it, the color, you can see why there is such a difference between the right angle process, personal destiny, and its geometry, and the left angle process, its transpersonal geometry, its transpersonal way of operating in the world. And after the break, I'll show you how that works. If I were, I do, for example, incarnation cross readings, and I stop at the line. And if you were actually to look at what somebody's profile is, that you would have a series of numbers. That is, the personality sun, you would have the gate, you would have the line, you would have the color, you would have the tone, you would have the base. Now, there it was a real difficulty for me in terms of introducing color, because color is something that is deeply interesting to people. As you will see, it's fascinating to look at that, but at the same time, it's very difficult to be able to make that calculation unless you have absolutely accurate birth time. So, for example, I have that for my children who are, clocked to the second, so that I've been able, given the knowledge I have, I've been able to look at their design right down to the base, and those things are truly fascinating. But again, one of the difficulties of operating with color as a generalized working theme is to be very clear that it is really limited according to birth time. We get, we're getting to a place here where this is fractions, and you're dealing with very, very small places of arc, and unless you have accuracy in that, I don't do charts when I don't have time. It's very dangerous to do that. It's particularly dangerous to try to, guess, so that you can see what your color happens to be. Color for me has always been something that will flourish in the years to come, when more and more of us pay attention to birth times, and there's greater accuracy, and there's more people that have the gift and the knowledge of being able to do analysis of that. As of January at my site, jovianarchive.com, there will be a special portal that will be opened for doing complete incarnation cross calculations, so that people will be able to have access to it. And at first it's only going to be available to teachers and analysts that are professionals, so that they can have access to that information just to begin to explore particularly color. Because again, if you go down to base, you go down to tone or to base, you have to have absolutely accurate time, otherwise it simply doesn't work. So very important to keep that in mind, and also important for you not to get, because I've had this every time I introduce color, people get really upset because they want to know what their color is. If you're sensitive enough to your own design, you will be able to intuit it, at least at the personality level. In other words, you will be able to get a sense of that. What's very important to understand is that your profile color dominates your life. Just in the same way that your line profile, your gate line profile, that gate line profile determines what your purpose is going to be and how you're going to live out that purpose in terms of your incarnation, that it's very important to understand that the color that is there in your profile, that color literally colors your whole design and colors your incarnation. Now, I'm not going to be dealing with this in the sense of applying it to charts, but I want you to keep that in mind, that the moment that you have color in your profile, it represents 70% in that sense of the way in which, you're going to be motivated and the way in which you're going to operate as your modus operandi. So again, color is something that is very, very important for us, but the limitation is birth time, and it's a serious limitation. And even accurate time is a misnomer. I don't trust hospitals.
Yeah.
The birth takes place and the doctor has to write down, the birth time, and they go and they have a cup of coffee and they relax and then they look at the clock and they say, okay, it was, the only thing I trust is what I've been through. That is, somebody who knows it's important and somebody who takes responsibility for timing it. And more and more people are doing that. I mean, I've spent the last 10, 12 years of my life telling pregnant women, time your child's birth, and I get that all the time. I get people who ask me for complete, and I do that. I get complete, perfect timings from people down to the second, and then I send them out the data. So it's part of our responsibility as educators to make sure that the next generation gets the benefits of the knowledge. But very few of us are really going to have an opportunity to see this. I'm one of the lucky ones. I mean, I'm plus or minus a minute in my birth data because I was cesarean and my mother actually selected the time. So for my generation, I'm very, very lucky that I have reasonably good time, but I still can't trust my base. I mean, it's clear to me my color's correct and so forth and so on, but again, unless you have accurate time, you can't trust it. And the problem is that we like to identify. And because you're going to have every single activation, after all, will have a color. So you can end up identifying with the color, and it's not really you, but you have parts of you that will resonate to that, and those kinds of things are unhealthy. I'm always very concerned about, people taking in information that may not be accurate and then trying to incorporate that into their process because it's not healthy for them.
I've got the numbers for the others, if somebody wants to.
Oh, good. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you take the moment when the baby's body is completely out.
Yes, the moment that the feet, I mean, if it's, as long as it's not breech, the moment that the feet leave. In other words, the moment that the infant is separate from the mother in space. It's not the cutting of the umbilical cord, it's not the first breath. Separate in space.
Mm-hmm.
I had some father, a friend of mine in Spain, whose child was just born, said to me, do I have to wait for the feet to come out? I said, yeah, gotta wait for the feet to come out. It's a deep embarrassment for me to harmonize the second color in my profile. You see, the whole business about the 5 and the 6 is look where they come from. They come from the 2 and the 3, respectively. And it's very important to see the root of that, because only the foundation that's laid in that sense in the 2 and the 3 is ultimately what is brought out as a force to influence the whole world. Yes, something like that. So when you're looking at the second color and you're looking at the second color and its fundamental relationship to the larger questions of life, that those larger questions of life are not answered by the master, but they are presented by the heretic. In other words, it's very important to see this relationship between the second color and the fifth color. Now, by the way, I'm not a fifth color, but I am a fifth line personality. And so I resonate to the conditioning that's there, that is the conditioning that's there within the context of how the fifth color operates. And you can see that the keynote of the fifth color is guilt. And its theme is to be the conditioner or the conditioned. Now look at my game. This is what the heretic does. Now, of course, what I do as a heretic is that I condition you to decondition your conditioning. But that's what the theme is. And the thing to recognize is about where we are, because it's really what I want to talk about in this last segment with the fifth and sixth color, to understand that this polarity between the 5 and the 6, we are at a change that's taking place in that polarity. And it's a very, very important change that's taking place because of the mutative quality of the sixth line. In other words, what we're going through is we're going through a transition in which the example is set. That the example in the past has always been set through the imposition of conditioning. And it is the heretic that has always done that conditioning. And it has either conditioned the theism or conditioned the anti-theism, whatever the case may be. But the way in which the heretic has operated is that it conditions others. That's why it's often deeply resented and burnt at the stake. Because it's very busy doing that conditioning job. And the way in which we have operated as a civilization for so long. Because remember, for most of our history, and at least for the nine-centered history, that what we're looking at is that the sixth line has yet to come to its blossoming of mutation. Which really isn't going to take deep impact until we get into the sixth line phase after 2027. So we're dealing with a transition point in which, in terms of my own mythology, however one wants to interpret that, in terms of my own mythology, I'm the last heretic. In other words, my job is the finishing of the conditioning business, because the end of the conditioning business is really where we're going. It is not the responsibility of one to condition the other. It is not the way in which the process works. And as you can see, that the heretic does not speak out of developmental processes. It's only the sixth color that in that sense harmonizes and learns from the personal developmental process. In other words, when you're dealing with the fifth color is simply going to one of the basic roots, and it's saying the most important thing to universalize is our spirituality. The most important thing, after all, that is the focus of the fifth color. And it is the focus of the fifth line as a heretic. The most important thing to universalize is spirituality. So me, who has never been spiritual, I still don't think of myself as being spiritual. I tend to think of myself as being alive. That I end up being a heretic that actually brings spirituality, but brings it through a mechanical structure. But it's my role to be a heretic, and only through my capacity to condition you. See, I never forget that I started only with not-self students. So, I had to seduce them. I had to condition them. They had to fall in love with me. I had to fall in love with design. I had to use every trick in the book, and not consciously, because it's not conscious. It's just the way it works. It's the way I'm designed to be. And of course, this is the old way, and I got to watch all of that so clearly that what I was doing was replacing one set of conditions with another. I had a friend of mine, Nikitana. I was sitting one day and he said to me, well, what are you going to call this? And I said, well, I think I'm going to call it the human design system. And he said, oh, don't call it a system. And he was going on and on and on about all of this. I have the role of conditioning beings to a new conditioning system. Fortunately, it's about conditioning yourself to decondition yourself to be yourself. So we go through this whole convoluted way, but please understand that's why I've always rejected what usually goes along with this kind of conditioning. I am your guru, honor me, all of this stuff, all of that trip, everything else. Part of my process has always been, I don't want to be your conditioner. I mean, what a joke. Because it is, because you can't escape that within the role. And this, please see, this is the old way. I'm the old way. I really am. I'm the end of a process. This is the old way. And the new way is upon us. And that new way is really very beautiful because it isn't keynoted with guilt. Oh, how many people I upset when I told them their design. How guilty they were that they didn't know before. How that hurt them. How guilty they were that they lived their lives that way. And all of that stuff. I know that movie. It's the Heretic movie. And it's about to become a rerun, It's going to go on late night television, and eventually it'll only be at 3 o'clock in the morning. And eventually you're just going to have to download it from the web if you want it, and finally it'll be gone. Because we won't need it anymore. And the real mystery is that it's very hard to sense that at this moment. Because all around us, you're seeing the very, very last attempts of the fifth color through the fifth line theme to still control the direction of the world. We live in a time of false prophets. We live in a time of all kinds of conditioning forces, positive, negative, and everywhere in between. There are all kinds of human beings trying to impose their way on the other. It's all over the place. And the thing to see about that is that when things are about to die is when there are so many examples of them. This is the end of the road for the fifth color theme. It's the end of the road. And so it's very, very important to grasp this transition between fifth and sixth color, between fifth and sixth line, and what that means for us in terms of our development as a species. When you're looking at color, you can look at the way the world works, because these are underlying motivations for the planet itself and the way in which we operate. So one of the major political themes that we have dealt with from the very beginning of our process, is this theme of communalism, separatism. And it is a theme that we see everywhere. We see separatist factions that exist in all kinds of places. When you look at whatever it may be, whatever it may be, the Basques in Spain, or, whatever happens to be the separatist movement, you can see that there is always this process that's going on between separatism and communalism in the way in which geopolitics operate. And that both of them are claiming that they're separatists out of fear. I don't want to lose my culture. I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to be threatened. All of them are operating out of fear. The communalists say, well, if we work together, then we can do better, and we don't have to be afraid, and we've got better security. In other words, you always have these two forces that are at work. It's the basic foundation of how we operate. And of course, one of the things to recognize about the presence of such a powerful motivating force as fear, and to recognize that the fear exists below the line, that at the psychological level, think about somebody that has a very assured chart. Somebody, for example, that might be, let's say, a manifestor, or a very strong generator, whatever the case may be, somebody's got a strong chart. In that chart is, the strength to deal with the world and go out and do this and do that. And think about what happens to them when their profile theme is going to be dominated by fear. All of a sudden that assuredness and that comfort that seems to be there on the surface really isn't there. And there are so many human beings who suffer from not understanding why they seem to have what appear to be irrational fears. They don't know why they're afraid. They don't know why certain situations bring fear out of them. And of course, that's the moment that they're really in trouble if they go looking for traditional help. Because that's the moment that somebody's going to make up a reason for them about why they think they're afraid in that situation, instead of understanding that this is their nature, that they are going to be in certain situations in which that motivating force is going to be there, and they have to learn to recognize that in order to understand it's okay. This is not an irrational fear. It isn't at all. It's the fear that drives us to master the world. It's the fear that's there that guides the investigator. And it's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of the unknown. And it's about getting to the point where the unknown is no longer frightening, getting to the point where things are solid. And so what we call science, all of that is a first color. It's all about overcoming fear through being able to study, investigate, and find a solid foundation. And whether you find that solid foundation in an investigation as a separatist, the mad scientist in the basement by himself, or whether you do that, for example, in these huge communal scientific investigation laboratories where thousands of people are trying to figure out things together, whether it's communalist or separatist, these are the underlying themes of our development. In the garden, the first color was the first color. Here, fear. Overcome the fear through the pursuit of knowledge. That's what's there. Now, of course, what happens to the mundane life that is being impacted by the first color is that, they don't care about all that. What they care about is that in certain situations, they have an uncomfortable fear and they don't know why it's there. And in those situations of that uncomfortable fear, either they want to run in and join something in order to feel safe, or run away from it in order to feel safe, and they don't know why. And the danger again in that is that you see the psychological community has come up with all of their ways of trying to explain those things and make up reasons for why those things exist, when in fact it's just mechanical. It's just mechanical. And that the only way in which you can deal with the first color is the way in which you deal with the first line. In other words, you have to get rid of the fear by understanding. And it's only through understanding that the fear can move away. When you look at the second color, we saw that the second color asks a basic question. And the basic question of the second color is why? And it's looking for that larger why, that larger reason. And it is a question that is being asked. In other words, it's a question that is rarely answered. It's a question that's being asked, and it's part of our, basic structure of being open to a larger whole. What you get to see in the fifth color is that the fifth color presents the answer to that why. Now, whether that answer is correct or not, that's not the point of this. But the point of this is to understand the role in that sense of the fifth color and the way it conditions or motivates the fifth line. In other words, that it needs to bring an answer to that why. And in bringing that answer to that why, trying to condition those who need to have an answer, trying to condition them to that answer. Here is the answer for you. Here's the answer to your question. After all, that is the thing about human design that I love so much, is that it not only provides you with answers, but it actually shows you where the questions are. In other words, all of those things are there. And so the ultimate role in that sense of the fifth color is to find and express universally in that sense what is the why. Now remember, it's coming from the why. But when you look at the third color, which is where the 6 comes from, when you look at the third color says, how? Like the fourth color, they both say, how? How do I get there? How do I develop? How do I grow? This is the how. And in that how, they're seeking development. Now, there's something very magical that happens to the 6th line being. And it's reflected through the way in which the 6th color motivates them. We know that in this mutative phase, all 6th line beings, 6th line profiles, need to go through in their life 3 distinct stages. And that first stage is how. That's the first stage. The first stage is the resonance to the third color, third line combination. In other words, how do I develop? And when you get to the end of the 6th line process and they come off the roof, the polarity to the first phase, it's not how, it's who. You see, in the end, It is all about being complete within yourself. This is what the role model is. Complete within yourself. I will give you a taste of the future. And in giving you a taste of the future, there's something that has been taking place for many years, became popularized in recent years, in which you see that heretics, spiritual guides, change people's names. Give them new names. Change their names. One of the most interesting phenomena of six-line people coming off the roof is that they change their own name. And they give themselves a name because they finally find out who they are. And in finding out who they are, they separate themselves from the name of their family. In other words, they stand alone with their own name. Now, if any of you live long enough, you'll see that phenomena, an extraordinary phenomena, in which people begin to name themselves. What's that? You mean in the sense of those people going through that process? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because, of course, the whole thing about the six-line mutation is that you finally are a role model outside of the influence and direction of others. You are your own authority. You are your own truth. And in that, names have great power. I mean, names have great power. They are great conditioning forces in our lives. I know what it's like to carry a name, and I know what that does. You know, it changes who you are. And it's very important to recognize that this is going to be one of those flavors that you'll see out there, is that you'll see these six-line beings, and they'll be coming off the roof, and all of a sudden they want people to call them this or that or whatever the case may be. In other words, they will find the who. And this is the whole movement. It's our movement. It's our whole evolution. And our whole evolution is getting to the point where individual power, individual uniqueness, individual integrity, that's the only criteria. The only criteria. If everybody behaves correctly according to their truth, according to their nature, you don't need heretics. You know, you don't need conditioners. You don't need any of those things. So this is the process that we come to. So when we're here at the sixth color, this innocence, it's the innocence that's given a name. It's the child that takes its unique flavor. It is its own true self. And of course, because of the nature of how this works, all six-line beings go through this process. And they go through this process in which most of them are devastated by the how phase. In other words, the developmental process, because it's a trial and error process, because it can be full of suffering and so forth and so on, taints them in such a way that they do not get to that point in which they can come off the roof. They can come off the roof as themselves, living what is correct for themselves and discovering in that who they are. Now that's the theme of my work, is to give human beings an opportunity to discover who they are. And to be able to do that is my way of providing the answer to the why. Why are we the way we are? Well, here's the mechanics of that. But the real development, and remember, the six is out of that third theme of development. The real development comes when each and every human being then follows their pattern, lives out the perfection of what it is to be them, to discover who they are. Because you can only discover who you are when you live out your design. There is no other way. And the moment you discover who you are, you discover something else. You're a different person. If you're a 1-3 or a 1-4 or a 4-1 or a 5-1, if you're any of those four profiles that carry a first line, you have to understand something. You're being conditioned. You're being conditioned. Whether you have the first color in your profile or not, every time you step into the world, you're being conditioned through residence, and you're being conditioned to be motivated by fear. When I get on airplanes, with all my first lines, when I get on airplanes, as long as there's anybody on that airplane that has first colors, the fear resonates through my body. And I know it's not me, because I'm truly, in terms of how I know myself, I'm not afraid in those situations, but I can actually feel the fear rising because I resonate to it. Now, I'm very comfortable in the knowledge of who I am, so I really know who I'm not. And I'm always very able in those kinds of situations to let those things move through. But I also recognize that the vast majority of humanity is not like that. And that if you carry a first line in your profile, that it's very easy for you to be made fearful by others. And it's not like they have to threaten you. They don't. They just have to be in your aura. And all of a sudden, there is this quality of fear, and you don't know why it's there. And for most people, they feel uncomfortable with that because they think there's something wrong with them. Or worse than that, they do something about it. In other words, they react to that conditioning. And because I can remember myself before I had all this knowledge, color revealed so much to me about the way in which the world impacted me and why I was always happiest being left alone and totally isolated. Being a separatist was really easy for me because nobody was cranking up all my ones. Yet at the same time, the communal forces that cranked up my ones made me a better teacher, made me a better investigator, made me deal with their fears so that I had to come up with better and better ways of explaining how things work. In other words, you have to see the positives and the negatives in the conditioning. But I want all of you to understand as we go through all these colors, that whatever you have as lines in your profile, aside from whether you can find out what your actual color is in the profile, whatever lines you have in your profile is going to resonate to these motivational themes. And for you to recognize that, it will give you a deep, deep insight into your relationship with the other and the way you operate in relationship to the other. It's our process, after all, and I don't want you to confuse this with it being specific in that sense to any kind of configuration, because what I'm describing here is a much larger evolutionary process that we all have aspects of all of it within us. All these colors are within us. We meet all the colors all the time as we meet all the lines all the time, whatever. And one of the things to recognize, it's like the nature of the fifth color and the recognition within the fifth color that the answer to everything is that everything is about being conditioned and conditioning. And everything is about being conditioned and conditioning. Now, the moment that you understand how that truly works, rather than we're being conditioned by, by the spirit of the west wind or, whatever those things are, when we finally get a concretized answer, in other words, when we can finally see how the conditioning, how the conditioner, how these processes actually work, it's not about staying there. If this were not my job, because this is my job now, if this wasn't my job, I wouldn't pay any attention to human design. Why should I? I'm awake. I mean, it's not like I have to pay attention to, what's there and what isn't there and this and that and blah, 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 and this gate and that gate and this conditioning and that conditioning. Blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter to me. I would be totally liberated if I didn't have to do this for work, and I wouldn't think about it because I wouldn't have to think about it. And of course, that's what transcendence is. That is, transcendence is when you get to a point that you really do understand how things work. And when you understand how you work, then you can let go. And that's the whole point. And of course, what we still have on the planet now, right now, because we're at the end of this era, is that we have all of these different forces trying to claim that answer. And so everybody is caught up in all of that, the conditioners and the conditioning. The real transcendence for us is that once you get the answer, you move on. And what you move on to is innocence. Innocence. And the innocence is about the pureness of existence. Oh, it's deeply spiritual. because it really is the recognition that everything happens. Everything happens. And that as long as you're correct within yourself, everything happens for you. It's one of the great pleasures in my life to realize that the entire Biverse is here for me. And I don't say that out of vanity. It's just a reality for me. I don't do anything and everything works. You know, there's nothing that I do and everything gets done. All the old stuff that I read about, I live it. And I live it without being responsible for it, or directing it, or choosing it, or selecting it. It just happens to me. And that's the whole point of all of this. You see, we're at the point where we're still being satisfied by the knowledge of the answer. And constantly reproving to ourselves that that answer seems legitimate. You know, you look at your kids, you look at this, you look at your lover, you check this, you check the cross that day, you look at the energy that way, and you keep on working with the condition process. And it's only when you finally get to that point where you're 7 years down the road of experimenting with your design, when you finally begin to experience without any kind of question that's the moment you can let go of all of that. And that's where we're moving. We're moving towards a global 6-line theme. Nobody's going to want to carry this stuff around. Nobody. The time of conditioners and conditioning of heretics, nobody's going to give them any attention. That time is coming. And the demand on us is that we have beings who can enter into that phase and enter into that phase innocent, being both observer and observed. Nothing else. In other words, they're alive. That's all. I had somebody come up to me one day and said, "What's it all for?" And I said, "Oh, just to be alive." Because that's the truth. And when you finally get to the point that you have an answer, you'll discover that all you're left with is you're alive. That's it. And that's what's so special. I mean, that's what's so special. And then to see something even better than all of that. That by being alive as yourself, everything in this life is there to nurture you. Everything. Everything. No matter how it looks. Because the moment that you're just there and you're just being is the moment that you see that is all that has ever been required. Ever. Ever. That's being enlightened, awake, holy, whatever you want to call all that stuff. To me, it's being alive. And this is the magic at the end of the process, because it's not about how or why or when. It's who. It's you. And that all that matters is that you're alive and correct in that. And if we had all kinds of people on this planet who were correct within themselves, you would be astonished at the change of the vibration. This is what we're moving towards. And what we're moving away from is this need within us, to be able to have all of the answers. And as long as there weren't an answer available, there was no way that we were ever going to get to the 6-line phase. And of course, all of this is designed. We're living in a time now where this is the last chance. Till 2027. It's the last chance for us. This has been going on since 1615. It's the last chance for us to find out exactly how things work and why they work the way they do. And we're going to go into a dark age like you've never seen. Different from the last one. But the next one is everybody within themselves. And everybody within themselves, this is a huge step for humanity. It's a huge step. And from 1960 to 1927, until 2027, this is the framework in which we can finally get to the information that we need to understand. And the last time, in terms of global cycles, that the 61-1 had this kind of power was 19,000 years ago in the garden. It's the last time it happened.
The
So-
61-1.
So what we're living in right now in terms of a global cycle is a window of resolution. Resolution of all those questions that began at the beginning of our consciousness process. And here we are with this window. And once we get past this window, there isn't going to be this same energy in the world to solve this problem and to find out how this works and blah. All of that's going to go away. It's going to go away overnight. But it's going to fade. And as the generation that's born still within this cycle dies off, then you are going to go in that sense, into a relative dark age. It's like all these people who think technology is just going to keep on getting more incredible. No. By 2027, the door is going to shut on that. And the future where you think you're going to have all these zippy machines, you're going to have 2027 machines that are styled differently in 2144. In other words, we're coming to the end of a period of incredible development, incredible understanding and grasping of things, but it will come to an end. And when it's over, it's us. It's all about us after that. And it's all about the pure existence. It's what we're here to be.